were discovered after the colonizers had left or our protectors had left. So we've tended to really carve our developmental path the way we could, using our resources the way we could. And even in the involvement of women in politics has not been really that much of an issue of contention per se. We know we need women, we know we need inclusion, we know we need social inclusion, we need girls, small girls in schools, and we've done that as a country. But we've never really had a pushback from patriarchy to say women do not get into these spaces. We are finding our spaces. Sometimes, yeah, we do get a little bit of resistance, but I think it's just for us to find different approaches and methodologies as women and fight our different causes and be involved as young girls, as youth, as women in our country. So I'm looking forward to really sharing more on what we're trying to do, especially as Botswana Center for Public Integrity. The system is not really pushing back, but I think to carve our path moving forward in Botswana, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Kuyok, Kuyok Abol Kuyok. I'm the Executive Director of South Sudan Anti-Corruption Commission. I think I'm going to set the scene about giving you a background about South Sudan and what we're doing in fighting corruption, and with the specific reference to the impact, corruption impact on women in South Sudan. Now, South Sudan was gained independence in July 2011, and as it was told this morning, it ranks one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I was here 5 years ago, and Botswana was still the least corrupt country in Africa, like today. Civil war at the heart of the suffering, because in our survey we had in 2016, in the middle of the civil war, we were able to go into 8 out of 10 states. And half of our respondents were female. And you could find that their experiences, their perceptions about corruption were completely different from the perceptions of men and even their own husbands. And this means that we need to give forum for these ladies to be able to tell their stories. But because of the issues that we talked about, the lack of power, that they don't have power, that is why their stories are not told, how corruption impacts them. Now, I have a different way of approaching this. I mean, my panelists, the colleague on the panel talked about hierarchy and things like that. Now, the ambassador from Ghana said something very important. I think we need to look at education. I think education here is key. Just pause for a minute and think about the word corruption in our languages. What does it mean? What does corruption mean in our languages? I think it's a very bad term if you translate it into an African language. It is theft. And we all of us shun theft, isn't it? So we need to educate our people. We need to educate the youth. And that is a challenge for all of us from school age, that this is bad. And that means you have to look at even the curriculum. For me, I'm a teacher. I look at it like this, that corruption came with colonialism. If you look at the African societies before colonialism, they had no problem like corruption. It didn't exist. Even women, we had queens when some kings were in Europe were killing their wives or their daughters. We had queens, we had chiefs. If you go to our societies, so the issue of power, this power dynamic problem came after the kind of education that we introduced. The education we have in Africa today doesn't address. It's a Western education with Western values. And our problem here today is that we are trying to impose these standards, these Western standards, on our context. And I think that is a problem. So we need to look at that. We also, I think, need to approach it like this. In South Sudan today, Mama, I think it was Mama Emma that talked about celebrating African women, pioneers in women empowerment. And we have many of them. We have many of them in Ghana. We have a lot of people. In South Sudan, we had this lady, Victoria Yararol. She was the first South Sudanese woman to go to university. And when she finished, she dedicated herself in fighting for women's rights. women's representation. And she went into politics. She married into polygamous marriage. She had 3 or 4, candidates or suitors, but she decided to use that because her husband was also a politician. And she decided specifically to target men, because men are the people that have this power. So they're your brothers, their husbands, and so forth and so forth. And told them that why it is important girls must be married at a particular age. Why it is important girls must go to school, okay? And those few ladies that were there, that were educated, she made sure that they were trained as teachers, as role models, as nurses, and so forth and so forth. So I think there is an American academic who said that power is like air. We can all share it. We can all breathe together. It doesn't need to go into particular people to own it. So if such a message could be imparted, could be communicated in a proper way, you'll find that some men would share power. And we have seen the advances that we made in Africa are actually led by men. If you look at Rwanda, if you look at this country, if you look at Ethiopia now, where you have a head of a state which is a woman, you have a cabinet which is half of it women. So these are men doing this. So I don't think men are there to frustrate women participation. It is that we need to do it in a proper way. So this morning somebody said that in this audience only 30% were men, and you can see on the panel the representation of men here. So next time, if you want to hold something like this, you need to make it half or even more men coming to talk about these issues, because these are the daughters, the mothers, and the sisters, and that they're talking about. So this is I would be happy to answer questions later, and this is what I think I need to say in the outset.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon once again, everybody. So my name is Ifeoma Judith. I work for a civil society organization called Public and Private Development Center. Our primary focus is on procurement government system improvement, and also trying to entrench accountability, efficiency, value for money in public procurement in Nigeria. We led an 8-month advocacy in 2016 that led the Nigerian government to adopt and implement open contracting data standards for procurement. I know some of us here might have heard when the British Prime Minister said that Nigeria is fantastically corrupt. You know, yes. And when we talk about corruption, my mind goes to, you know, the work we do in Nigeria, the field work we do, because that is where corruption thrives. In procurement, where government keeps on budgeting millions in each fiscal year. But when you get to the field, you don't see things that are in tandem with what the data speaks. And I think it's about amplifying the voice of women, and also hearing from the beneficiaries, the people who are suffering the brunt of corruption. Because it's important. We need to hear from them. How do we also make sure that we amplify their voice in a patriarchal society, which is also very important. And we've seen quite a lot, victims of rape, people who are suffering as a result of public funds not being judiciously utilized to provide the basic things that they need. And when I say basic things, I'm talking about things like primary healthcare centers. We know the importance of primary healthcare centers in Nigeria. How do we make sure that we amplify the voices of these women, hear from them, and also provide information that will enable them to make decisions, say what they want and how they want it, what kind of data do they want, and how do they want those data to be provided to them. Because we believe for us to curb corruption, you know, prior to now, we've always thought that corruption has to do with embezzlement of public resources. But now I'm also very happy that Africa as a continent has started redefining what corruption means. It also means inappropriate behaviors, for example, could even be corruption. So how do we start redefining it within our own context, and then ensure inclusivity, ensure that everybody is brought on board, everybody lend their voices, lend their resources to kick out this thing that is called corruption from Africa, because I don't think it's what men could do alone. but also we have champions. In Nigeria, for example, we have women who are at the forefront of fighting this corruption. How do we also join forces with them, share best practices, lend our voices, talk about people that are the beneficiaries and people who have suffered most in as a result of corruption and embezzlement of public resources, bring everybody on board to achieve what we want.
Thank you. I think one of the emerging shifts in our context on the continent is that we are seeing increasing privatization, where our governments are borrowing money from private sector. And therefore, this means even the priorities for development are not determined on what is in the interest of the citizens, but more around the issues of profitability. I don't know where we see this trend going. How do we arrest this trend? And how do we involve women in being involved in doing the identification of priorities, in supervising implementation, in being involved in holding local authorities accountable? So maybe your thoughts on that, and maybe what you've been able to do in your individual countries to sort of curb this emerging trend.
So at FemNet, we work at the intersection in the program that I lead on women's rights and women's rights intersecting with macro level economic justice. So we feel there's a lot that's been done at a micro level, financial inclusion, access to microcredit, but there hasn't been enough done, especially on the African continent, at the intersection of women's rights and debt, for example, women's rights and illicit financial flows, of privatization and what it means in PPPs, what it means for our continent, what it means for the women and girls of this continent. And so I'll link that to the conversation around data, because it's inextricably linked and one that's important. And at FemNet, we feel quantitative data is just not enough. You cannot relegate our lives to statistics and numbers. And so 30% of this room might be men, but too many a time I have been in meetings on macroeconomic policy where I'm the only woman, and I'm the only woman or individual under the age of 65. And so this needs to change. And so when we talk about data, we need to be able to include qualitative data as well, to begin to tell the lived realities and experiences of women and of girls and what corruption means for their daily struggles. An African woman experiences corruption every single day of her life, from trying to get a child into school, to accessing healthcare, to reporting a crime, to not having any mechanisms to protect her as a whistleblower. We experience it every day, and these are narratives that don't get captured in mere numbers. And so we need to begin to collect data in a different way. And so then I'll link that with the financialization of development and the growing, the trend of our governments borrowing money at commercial rates for development processes. And what does that mean when a private sector or multinational has priority and say on what gets done, what gets built in your country? What does this mean for the social contract that you supposedly have as a citizen between you and your state, and this contract that is beginning to move to look like one that is a contract between state and multinational? What does it mean for a woman who needs to access maternal health care when it's not profitable for a private sector company to build a maternal hospital, but instead it's profitable for them to build a mega highway which has a toll, which a woman, a smallholder farmer, cannot afford to pay and needs to move her produce from point A to point B, but at the end of the day, country needs to pay it back, and so her tax and her VAT goes up. We need to be asking those questions. And so at FemNet, we need to be able to be having more women at these tables, and as Mama Kalia said in the morning, if you're not at the table, you're definitely on the menu. And for far too long, the women of Africa have been on the menu.
Thank you very much for that important question. In Botswana, I said earlier that we're very fortunate. And that has also meant that we tend to be complacent at times about certain things because everything has been just done and given. Now, look, the work that we do at Botswana Center for Public Integrity is really to empower citizens in knowing how to hold government accountable, using different tools, using different methodologies and approaches, and one of them is, I guess, purporting the culture of integrity and social accountability as one of the tools that we would like to use to really reach people on the at the grassroots. we believe that when you
Sudan, I think you would imagine that. I was asked to talk about a post-conflict situation, but I think we are a post-in-conflict situation because conflict never left us. We had peace, and then we jumped into plunged again into war. So, women in South Sudan, the majority of women in South Sudan are actually struggling with issues of bread and butter. This is it. The daily lives about how safe would they go and collect firewood, get water, and come back home safe, and how safe would their kids be? So these are the issues that the majority of them are suffering with. But I think it is important that women get involved. We learned that Ghana's demographic statistics show that only 48% of the population is men. The same in South Sudan. 51% of the population in South Sudan are female. So if you leave out the majority of the country, then you will expect to have a proper socioeconomic development. So it is important that these women are involved. Now, we had some advances. In the Constitution, it says that 25% of public constitutional post positions must go to women. So in the parliament today, where Victoria sat with the two girls, the Victoria that I told you, with the two women, there are now 104 female MPs out of 400. So that is a progress. And that in the cabinet, there must be 25%. And this is the same also at the sub-national levels, that women are represented in those figures. But of course, there are some disadvantages. Have also had some drawbacks. For example, we had one state governor that was popularly elected, and because the parliament of Harris State was dominated by men, they launched this crusade to impeach her, And the thing went on and on and on. And one of the accusations was labeled against her was that she was pregnant, and that a sitting governor of a state cannot be a childbearing, something like that. So at the end, she lost her position. She lost her position, and she was the only single popularly elected governor of a state. So there are these issues about how do we take this thing forward. Now, there's a peace agreement that was signed in Khartoum in August this year, and in the peace agreement, the peace agreement recognizes that corruption was at the heart of the problems in South Sudan, which is really very important. That corruption was one of the drivers of conflict in South Sudan, and therefore it must be attended to. So one of the most important clauses in the peace agreement is that we have to address the issue of corruption in South Sudan, and that the issues of good governance, rule of law, and the interim government that is going to come up in as to implement the peace agreement must therefore implement this provision, which is fight against corruption. So we hope. I was in Arusha with the AU-ABC, and we're talking about ratification of the African Union Convention against corruption. And in fact, they wrote a letter to our ambassador in Ethiopia. So we hope then we will be able to ratify some of these instruments in our fight against corruption. But the message is that it is not easy in a situation like South Sudan, where women involvement is yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think to me, and I think it's all about systems and processes, you know. So building strong systems that can allow anybody, irrespective of their gender, to be actively involved in the things that they have reason to value. And I keep referring back to procurement, because I know that's where government plunged a large chunk of its money to basic services for the citizens. And what we've done as a civil society organization in Nigeria, before we even started advocating for Nigeria to adopt open contracting, is to start speaking to people. Over the years, we've relied on the Nigerian Freedom of Information Act to be requesting for information relating to public finance expenditure. And even when we have access to this information, asking for government to deploy tools, we realize that if the people that these things affect it doesn't interest them to be part of the processes. And we as civil society, we don't want to be the one asking government to do this and also being the one monitoring the tools. So there's need for us to start sensitizing the people, especially the women. How do we make them to come out of their closets, to start speaking up, to start even using the data that we produce or that the government puts out there to start monitoring primary healthcare centers, for example, education projects that are being executed for them. There's quite a lot of education to be done because people need to understand, because we're talking about, for example, in this part of the world where people are still battling with basic needs of man, food, water, and all that. So how do you make sure that you bring them on board? How do you make sure that they join the fight? How do you make sure that they even, have interest to start using the data? What will make them to even, start asking, interrogating government? So that's why we had to start doing a lot of campaign, sensitization campaign, education, capacity building for rural communities. We focus mostly recently on rural communities because we know that 90% of the projects that have been awarded at the federal level are being implemented at the state level. So we had to start making sure that people understand the traditional procurement, for example. Because if you don't understand the basics, which is the traditional, how can you now understand the public-private partnership that is much more technical? So, and I'm happy that we've started seeing a lot of impact since we moved to the grassroots, because we had to start linking data, for example, to their purchasing power, even to their electoral choices that they make. If you vote in the wrong person, collect 2,000 naira, for example, today, it will probably affect the number of completed healthcare centers you will have in this community in the next 5 years. If you do this, this is what is going to result to in the near future. So you start having that kind of cultural and behavioral change that you want, that are necessary to start pushing and also start interrogating the entire government processes. So I think it's very, very important that we do a lot of campaigns around sensitization and making sure that people understand what corruption means and the essence of or the usefulness of using data to question what government provides for them.
Thank you. Maybe since you still have the microphone, one of the progressive things we've been seeing in Nigeria of late is that a lot of the resources that had been taken out are coming back home. So from the outside, it looks like a very rosy picture, and many of us on the continent are hoping that that happens for us as well. But what is the process? Is there a process in place to ensure that those resources that are coming back are actually diverted to the right priorities for women, especially for young people? How do we ensure that that money that is coming back doesn't go towards financing luxury houses, aeroplanes, but that actually it goes back into healthcare, education, water, things that are really relevant for our citizens?
Thank you very much. When you were mentioning making sure that this money are put into all the productive sectors, what came to my mind is making sure that these monies that are coming back are not even re-looted, for example, because that's also a very big risk. So, and I'm happy that a lot of civil societies has come on board recently. We have ANIJ that has been following up closely with repatriation of looted funds in Nigeria. And I know a lot of discussion has been going on lately, even to monitor the repatriation and also monitor how these funds are being implemented, how these funds are being used to, put into productive sectors or to even provide basic healthcare and education for the citizens. And I know recently that there was, I'm not really very sure about that, let me not just say that, but I know a lot of discussion recently have been going on because recently the Nigerian government declared education sector a priority, a state of emergency on the education sector, and a lot of this repatriated funds are being taken into that sector to make sure that we reform education in Nigeria and also within the health sector.
Thank you. Kuyok, South Sudan in the recent past has been in the media around the Profiteers documentary. So maybe some thoughts around how you're dealing with the cartel.
to do that. The legal framework that we have is very limited. So it doesn't give us the capacity to be able to investigate such an international kind of a problem. We also have capacity of people, you know, in terms of even the manpower and the technical capacity. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, that because of war, you'll find that the priorities of the country have changed. So the priority now is to fight the war. Okay, it's not about good governance or rule of law. So, and this is why in the peace agreement it was clearly stated that rule of law must be number one. Fighting corruption must be number one. Okay, and that means the commission must be resourced to be able to do this. The other issue which is sad, the other problem which is also sad is that our cooperation with our colleagues in the other jurisdictions is not very good. Colleagues from Kenya and Uganda, because we had these cases of corruption that we would investigate with them. So we find that colleagues would not cooperate with us in giving us information and so forth and so forth. So this is another issue. So the capacity is a problem, and as we've seen in the Baker report, when I was actually here, we were discussing the illicit financial flow. That was 5 years ago, and the amount of money that gets out of Africa, I mean, the 50 billion, is huge. It's really a lot of money. So it is something that we are looking into. It is something that we are potentially going to investigate, but we will need cooperation with colleagues from the other end.
Putetso, I think from what Kuyok is saying, 5 years ago, Botswana was doing well. 5 years later, Botswana is still doing well. So maybe some ideas on what is going right that we could learn from, and maybe in terms of practical terms, how do you protect whistleblowers? What kind of progressive structures, if any, have been put in place to enhance the role of citizens? How are the collaborations? What kind of partnerships have you put in place to actually manage this? Earlier in the morning, people were talking about the fight on corruption not being resourced. How is Botswana resourcing the fight against corruption? And where are the women in this structure?
Oh, wow. That's 5 questions, huh? I would say that, I mean, if you look at the TI CPI, you'll find that we've actually fallen like by 2%. I think we're like at 61 from 63. So I would say maybe the past 5 years we've regressed a little bit. For us, I always say, you know, Botswana, we must compare ourselves to better developed countries. I'm sorry, we must not compare ourselves to Sudan, for example, because we want to do better and improve the lives of Botswana, of that ordinary Botswana. So I'd say we are fortunate, again, that word again, we're fortunate that even though we have institutions in place, our institutions haven't been tried that much until probably say last year or maybe past couple of years, where we've had a few scandals, so you know, corruption scandals that we are handling, and we handle them as per legal frameworks allow. And we trust that our frameworks will you know, come through for us. And if they don't, we will learn the loopholes that we have, and we will learn the limitations that our legal frameworks might have in combating corruption or looking into control mechanisms. This actually highlights the importance of strong institutions and having integrity systems in place. We probably took it for granted that, you know, having maybe the ombudsman or a functioning parliament or having an auditor general or having different boards and how they are equipped in terms of people who are members of these boards. We probably took it for granted before because we're never really trialed and tested, but we have been the past couple of years. And there we're starting to see that maybe we need to really look into the people we put in our boards. Maybe we really need to look into what happens with the levy funds that we have, because they've tended to be, to be used or misappropriated. And these things can only take place if the systems in place in our institutions are not watertight. So we have regressed a little bit, but 2%, but we are waking up now. And I think that's when our civil society organizations like Botswana Center for Public Integrity come in and say, hey, Botswana, let us wake up. Let us wake up and see what we need to do to hold our government accountable and ask for more openness and ask for more transparency and involve everyone. Now we know what has been happening when women are left behind, or most of them are left behind. So it's our work, and I believe that our government is actually committed to involving everyone moving forward in transparency and accountability work. When it comes to whistleblowing, we've only recently, last year actually, enacted the Whistleblowing Act. We have looked at the act as civil society. The DCEC has been, educating about the act. We have, from our office anyway, we've said the act is good. However, we need to put procedures in place to really ensure that whistleblowers are protected. The act is there, is good, but it has some limitations. If you do not know as a whistleblower how to go about blowing the whistle, that you might risk not being protected by the law. So as civil society, we are working with the trade unions to come up with a booklet or a procedure or even an advice center where people could call in or send an email and say, hey, I want to blow the whistle, how can I do it that I'm protected by the law? Yeah.
Thank you. Crystal, I think one of the emerging conversations on the continent is around the demographics, that we have a very huge youth population, and more than half of those young people are young women. We all know what the reality of life is for young women on the continent, for young girls. What kind of investment needs to take place to actually convert this population into a demographic dividend in light of corruption, in light of curtailing corruption and curtailing cartels? What do you see the future looking like for the continent in terms of investments that need to be made with the money that is currently sort of flowing out of the continent, with money that is being looted? If the situation was to be reversed, what would need to be done with that money for us to get where we go by 2063?
So, as an activist, I'm going to be deviant and answer my own question. I'll not look at just where we want to go, but the process of how to get there. And so at Femnet, we have begun work on building the capacity of women's rights organizations and activists to understand the intersection of women's rights and macro-level economics. And I like to quote Pablo Picasso when he says, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. So current macroeconomic frameworks and systems don't work for us. They don't work for us. We subsidize the state, we subsidize the global north, and something needs to change, and it needs an audacious disruption. And so by this, we're bringing women and women's rights organizations and activists to this table where they can learn how things work so that we can break it and build a different system. We're not asking for space at a table that is already so ineffective, so unequal, and so unjust. What we're saying is we need to disrupt it, destroy it, and build systems that are transformative, that are responsive, and that work for all of us being women in all our diversities, all of us being citizens, despite age, despite religion, despite ethnic grouping. It needs to work for all of us. And it's also based on a very Pan-African bedrock. In the fight for women's rights, we understand that we're all fighting the same war, but we're fighting very, very different battles. On the front of illicit financial flows, Africa, the last figures, Africa loses $100 billion through illicit financial flows. $100 billion. So I can't even fathom what that means, and I can't fathom what that means for the development, for an investment in women and girls. 78% of our population in Africa is in the informal sector. 78% of the whole entire population of Africa. So if you look at the figures, you begin to build a narrative, begin to see where the problems lie. How can we ensure that we're really working to implement Agenda 2063, despite all of our problems of resourcing it? How do we choose between Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030 that is so well resourced, and what does that mean for our African aspirations and our African priorities as described, as narrated by us? And so inclusion is expensive, but needs to be done. Inclusion in a way that is not just women, young people, persons with disabilities that are annexed and mainstreamed and cross-cut in documents, but are done so in a meaningful way, in a just way, in a way that, you know, I have a seat at the table and I have meaningful impact, and I'm not just a number of 30% of a criteria that needs to meet a criteria, but my voice is heard, it's meaningful, and I know the technicalities of what needs to be done to be able to change my life and the lives of so many women and girls on the continent. And so as I was preparing, and I like quotes, I came across Amal Cabral from one of our island states, and he says, and this is what also drives a lot of the thinking, he says, and I quote, "Always remember that the people are not fighting for ideas, nor for what is in men's minds. The people fight and accept the sacrifices demanded by the struggle in order to gain material advantages, to live better and in peace, to benefit from progress, and for the better future of their children. National liberation, the struggle against colonialism, the construction of peace, progress, and independence are hollow words devoid of any significance, unless they can be translated into a real improvement of living conditions." And so this is what we're fighting for. Real, tangible change for people who live in dignity, and to think that dignity must come before development is something that we need to think about more closely.
Thank you. I'm sure listening to the panelists, you probably have questions, comments that you want to ask. I already see one hand has shot up there, 2, 3, 4, 5 to my sister in purple. So let's start with those, and then we'll take another round. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Oh, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Bimbola Aladejari from Nigeria. I'd like to add more of a comment, to the discussion. The panelists have done fantastically well. And I want to take my ride from the discussion of Mr. Kayuk, where he talked about our value system. During the lunch, I was having a conversation with the guys on my table, and I said, for us to go back to, for us to achieve a corrupt-free continent, we need to go back to our value system. I'm afraid for the coming generation. I'm afraid for the generation of young people of today. I'm afraid for what we will see in the next 20 years if we do not address the current young people, particularly primary and secondary school. Many years ago, the value of integrity is more promoted and rewarded in the society than today. Today, everyone is more concerned about making money, looking good in the presence of people. And there's this social pressure, that promotes corruption in the society that we also need to look at. We did a anti-corruption project back in Nigeria with my organization, the New Generation Girls and Women Development Initiative, with support of UNODC and UNDP. And what informed that project was our engagement with children and teenagers. We had some questions to primary school, 5 years to 10-year-old boys and girls, and we asked them, if you become the president of Nigeria or the governor of our state, what will you do? And the feedbacks we got was very shocking. We had 5-year-olds saying, I'm going to build a mansion, I'm going to buy a helicopter, I'm going to go back to a village and make, you know, my father's house look more beautiful. And we realize that the problem that is cooking up is much more than what we have. And when we also look at our educational system, we realize that the values are gone. Primary school boys and girls are encouraged to pay higher money to have special center. They call them special students, where answers to exam are provided on the board during examination. You know, all of these things, it communicates one or two things to our children, and it makes people believe that corruption is a norm. Corruption has somehow been normalized. If you also look at some issues of security agencies on the highway, you realize that there are certain security agencies, they collect bribes from motorists, and because of their, I don't know, maybe trying to protect their dignity, they use children, you know, to collect this money from motorists. So these children pretend to be hawking goods, and they walk towards the motorist and collect the bribe. At the end of the day, they retire this money to the security agencies. And the concern around this is these children continue to accept and believe that corruption is normal. So if we don't address this issue, the adults that we have in the private sector, in the civil service, are already used to corruption. Not all, but majority. And there is an adage that says it's better to build a child than to repair an adult. So I believe that if we really want to go ahead and fight corruption as a continent, we need to have programs in place for this generation of children and young people. Our project then reached schools, primary and secondary schools. We used songs, we used armbands, we used promotional materials that they could relate with, and we got feedbacks that these children came back to tell us they didn't know. They thought once you finish secondary school, the next thing you begin to do is look for money.
Thank you, Abimbola.
So I think we need to also look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Tigist?
Thank you. My name is Tigist. I'm from Ethiopia. I have one question for Mr. Kuyuko, and I have one comment. As a comment, you raised corruption was not there before colonization. How could you reach in this conclusion? Because, for instance, in Ethiopia, we have corruption, it's known, but we were not colonized like other African countries, but from what I have learned or from what I have heard, our ancestors used to give bribe for some officials if they do something. So they're expecting something if we put corruption in a wider sense. So how could we conclude in other colonized Africans they were free of corruption? Because every country have its own what we call it values and traditions. So from our traditions we can say now it's a big issue. Corruption was not a big issue in the past time. So I want your opinion, because I have even seen it in the other way. The other comment I give is I believe, or I learn, corruption is the end result of inequality. If men were, if our men believe or accept women are equal with men, we would see other women in our parliament. We can see ministers. That's how. Or the government doesn't want women to be empowered, or even though they are educated, they don't want to accept them in some officials. Even in Ethiopia now, currently, everybody is talking, women are elected in the ministers, like they have, half of them are women. For me, I don't accept women to be in this kind of position, because where is the end point that we say we need empowerment? The men are in power for the past 27 years, and we are paying, or women are affected with corruption because of the wrong deeds of these men. So they have to pay. But I don't believe that women should should be the president, or I have to be a judge. I don't believe in empowerment. Empowerment should be given for everyone, but for me, I don't care whether my president is a man or a woman, unless he is a corrupt. So we have to change the men. They are the one who are creating, or who are the one believing, even they are made us to believe we are unequal. So for me, corruption is not my issue. We have to ensure women are equal in the eyes of men. So, for example, corruption is in every house. If my husband is a corrupt, I am already affected, because if he is one day caught, or if he is found to be guilty, I am going to lose everything. So if I'm living with my father, and if my father is unofficial, and if he's corrupted, then I am going to be...
Thank you, Tigist.
So
Please introduce yourself, the organization you're representing, and then ask your question.
All right,
or make the comment.
My name is Tagbo Akbazwe. I introduced myself earlier. I'm involved in a number of research projects on the continent looking at the intersection of gender and corruption. I've got a couple of comments and one question. I mean, patriarchy has very deep roots, not just here in Africa, but globally. And one of the tools that we have to increasingly look at as, to dismantle patriarchy is engaging with, with media, both popular, traditional, and social media, in terms of how people on the continent are socialized and our new evolving value systems. Secondly, the other point I wanted to make is that, when you look at access, there's certain critical sectors that are very important in terms of protecting women's rights. You're looking at access to schools, public hospitals, public utilities, ID, photos, cards and permits, courts, the police service. Afrobarometer has, over the past 3 to 5 years, undertaken a number of research projects looking at how vulnerable these public services are to bribery. And by a very long shot, on a scale of 0 to 10, the police service in Africa is the most corrupt public service that's provided, followed by access to courts. And I think, I think it's important that, that we look at the integrity of the police service as a very critical aspect of, fighting corruption that affects women. Thirdly, I just wanted to say, in terms of the reparation of resources that you were talking about, moderator, I think the examples from Nigeria is a drop in the ocean. I mean, we're talking about $600 million from Switzerland, which Nigeria ended up splitting 50-50 with Switzerland. So we're talking about 300 million. It's a drop. It's a drop in the ocean. I think the key thing here is that we need to prevent the money from leaving in the first instance. We need, this calls for strengthening our anti-money laundering systems, the financial, the integrity of our financial systems need to be strengthened. If you look at the Basel report on anti-money laundering globally, you'd see that the majority, actually the best, on the current 2018 report, the best African country there is South Africa, sitting at about, just as a medium risk country. The most of the African countries are actually medium to low risk, to high risk in terms of the risk of money laundering. Then I think one of the things that is quite important is that, and this has led to the frustration of a lot of African leaders in terms of the CPI indexes. You will notice that a lot of the innovative approaches to combating corruption, and sometimes even mainstreaming gender in that fight has come not from the best African countries in terms of the CPI index, but some of the mid to low African countries. I'll give you an instance. We undertook a study which our colleague from South Sudan was also part of, as part of the AU African Gender Scorecard 2018, which, as you know, is focused entirely on corruption. We undertook a research. Part of the research involved looking through all the national anti-corruption strategies of as many African countries that made theirs available. And you'd see that a country like Ghana, for instance, by a long shot, has the best national anti-corruption strategy. In the wording of the text, they've mainstreamed all your CEDAWs and the text from the Maputo Protocol. They have a gender desk. But part of it is also because of the way they've structured, the way their national anti-corruption agency, the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, which acts as the Human Rights Commission, which acts as the Ombudsman, and which acts as the National Anti-Corruption Agency. So the work of these three, having this kind of hybrid role enables that cross-pollination of this issue around gender and corruption. Finally, I just wanted to ask the panelists, this is where my question comes in. I saw it in sort of the notes building up to this session. What's a human rights-based approach in terms of, fighting corruption and mainstreaming gender? I was hoping to get clarity on that from the panelists. Thank you very much.
You are number 5. There was another hand just behind me. Yes, you, and then my sister Marco.
Thank you very much. Since I'm seeing that on this, we have a 4 language, and I'm here and I never hear somebody speaking Portuguese. I'm going to speak in Portuguese. Muito obrigada. Are you ready? I'm just going to speak in Portuguese to have a gender equality, ok? Muito obrigada mais uma vez. Eu sou Julina Arcolete, sou a fundadora da empresa Apelo Mundial. Bom, ouvi aqui com muitos colegas a se falar acerca da corrupção e ouvi muito mais as mulheres a falarem acerca da corrupção. Eu sou um exemplo de uma das mulheres que foi usada para fazer passar a corrupção num dos empregos que eu tive há 10 anos atrás. Por causa disso, e por estar a ver que a corrupção beneficiava a maioria do nível alto e trazia prejuízos para as pessoas do nível baixo, eu acabei resignando o emprego que eu tinha. Foi por isso que eu criei a minha própria empresa, com os meus próprios custos, para ajudar aquelas pessoas que em algum momento sofreram ou sofrem até hoje por causa da corrupção. Como sabem, como têm ouvido, há muitas histórias de corrupção que se fala em Moçambique. Se vocês têm visto os jornais, as notícias, os mídias, dos muitos casos de corrupção que se registram em Moçambique, 1% ou 2% é que saem ao alto, só para não dizer que Moçambique não está a lutar ou não está a ter a luta contra a corrupção. Este protocolo que se falou hoje, o protocolo de Maputo, quando nós voltamos a Moçambique e perguntamos o que é que está a acontecer, o que é que está a ser dito, não há resposta. Parece que o protocolo só se usou o lugar Maputo para se falar do protocolo. De fato, não está a acontecer nada. Os gabinetes de corrupção que estão em Moçambique, os casos que vêm sendo julgados em Moçambique, só servem para denunciar as pessoas de nível baixo. Por exemplo, eu tenho amigos que são juízes e que as pessoas que cometeram a corrupção são os pais, ou o irmão, ou a tia, ou por aí, não conseguem condenar. Eles pegam os casos de corrupção e arquivam. Se formos a ver Moçambique neste momento, ou nesta legislação do novo presidente, temos 40% dos cargos dos altos níveis são ocupados por mulheres. Mas são estas mulheres que estão neste momento a sofrer aquilo que eu sofri há 10 anos atrás. Estão a ser usadas para fazer passar a corrupção. Moçambique neste momento está a se registrar um boom por causa do oil and gas. Não sei mais uma vez se vocês têm ouvido as notícias, há muita descoberta que está a ser feita a nível de Moçambique. O que é que está a acontecer, ou o que é que vai acontecer em termos de responsabilidade social para estas multinacionais que estão a entrar para Moçambique? já foram feitas leis, já foram tomadas medidas, mas aquela comunidade, aquela população que está ali próxima, não se está a beneficiar de nada. O Estado já concessionou. Temos um exemplo muito mais grave ainda, que foram das dívidas ocultas que ouvimos de Moçambique, e neste momento, aquilo que vier daquelas multinacionais, daqui a 2, 3, 4 anos, vai se reverter para pagar aquela dívida oculta, que quem criou foram as pessoas do mais alto nível. Então, falar de corrupção em Moçambique, estamos a falar um bicho de 7 cabeças. Por mais que tu tenhas iniciativas, como eu tenho tido essas iniciativas, não há ninguém que te vai apoiar. Por quê? Porque a corrupção vai prejudicar as pessoas que não podem ser prejudicadas e que não podem ser tocadas nesse nível. Nós perdemos anualmente 300 milhões de meticais por causa da corrupção. Imaginemos 300 milhões de meticais para beneficiar a muitos projetos que existem em Moçambique. Estaríamos a desenvolver. Então...
Thank you.
I didn't finish yet, but okay. Okay, fine.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. My name's Abeti Sande. I'm from South Sudan. I work with an organization called Community Empowerment for Progress Organization. I thank all the panels, but I feel ashamed when I'm talking of corruption. As we know, South Sudan, what kind of corruption we have in the country. We don't have a proper mechanism in order to address the issue of corruption in the country. Even women does not have access. We have the bad cultural norms that is being impacted on us as women of South Sudan. In South Sudan culture, women are not allowed to talk or to speak in public space where men are there. And it has been used again as, this is one. The second component is even access to justice. I cannot travel with my child. As a mother, I don't have right to travel with my child. They have to ask the opinion from the father. The father has to give me agreement so that I have to go with the child. Even if the baby is breastfeeding, what kind of a country is this? That is kind of corruption. I will not say that we have anti-corruption, but we have uncle corruption. Why I'm saying this? Because a lot of things has been happening. My colleague who is sitting there, he's from anti-corruption, but nothing has been done. What kind of a country is that? And if also it is a shame for us to say that we have inherited. There's nothing that we have inherited. Most of the African countries has been colonized by the British. But does it mean that because they've been colonized, you have to loot the resource of your own people? That's not fact. You know, we South Sudanese, sometimes it is obviously when we start talking, we need to have that fundamental right which has been given. Women have been raped, no one is talking about it. You cannot fear, you are fearing to send your girls to go to school. Girls are being put as auctions so that men can compete on that, and we say it is our culture. Where are we? We are in which century? As South Sudan, we need a lot to be done. There's a long process for us as people of South Sudan. My question goes to my colleague who came from South Sudan. What are the mechanisms in place? Since we have this, a lot of things that has happening. Government has been announcing that there's some people, 72 people who have, their names has been announced that they have looted the resources of the country. What are the mechanisms, anti-corruption put in place in order to ask those people? This is one. Two, regarding the issue of justice, women, the rights of women, how far have we gone with it? And again, we are going to say that that's our culture. The second thing I wanted to know from my sisters who are sitting in the panel, what are the mechanisms in place they put in order to have that little improvement on how to combat and then how to fight for the women's rights. I was detained 3 times. Starting the 2013 incidents, I was detained in prisons. I was pregnant, I was beaten until the baby came out. No one spoke about it. And here we are saying that anti-corruption is there. We don't have human rights even. South Sudanese, we don't have the fundamental rights of understanding what is the human right and what is the human rights talking about. We didn't go out of putting a system in place of the referendum we have. For us to sit as a government and put a system in place, we don't have. The country is there, we have to loot. The innocent people are sleeping under the tree. No one is talking about it. Yes, the peace agreement is signed. I want to say one thing. Yes, the constitution has been amended. It's 35%. It's not now 25% for your information commissioner. It is 35%. But what has been done? The violation has started from the day one. Nothing has been done. The peace agreement is signed. It is only a paper, an ink on a paper. But there is nothing. We need to be honest. for us to combat this corruption within the African continent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have seen 3 hands for the next round of questions. I've seen 5, so I'll stop at that. So I'll give the panelists a chance to respond, and then we take another round of questions. I think there were a lot of questions for you, Kuyok, so maybe we start with you.
Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't being targeted.
And maybe let's keep it brief and precise,
yes,
so we can have another round.
I'm going to be brief here. Sister from Nigeria, I think she raises a very important point. Children are not born corrupt. I think it is us that corrupt them, okay? And that is why we need to take this conversation out of this room, to our homes, to our schools, you know, to our families, to our communities. There's a problem with materialism that is going on. I have a member of parliament who's a friend of mine told me in 2013 that what is happening in South Sudan is that we have taken the hunger from the stomach to the heart. So we have just had lunch, and you could eat as much, but if you are greedy, then you can't be satisfied. And I think that's the problem, greediness, and that is what is causing all this problem, billions and billions of money from Africa being taken away. So that is a problem. We need to educate ourselves, and we need to start it with the children, with our own children. Honorable Justice, I think Tegis, yeah, I think Tegis. When I talk about African context, and I asked you in the beginning to think about the term corruption in your own language. What does it mean? It means something very bad, the equivalent of that word. And I think you would not want it to be. If somebody is described like that, you wouldn't really. You would not want to be you. So yes, Ethiopia is one of the countries in Africa. I mean, the only country that wasn't colonized. I think it was colonized for 5 years or something, because the emperor was in Sudan. Haile Selassie was in Sudan in exile, fighting the Italians. I'm not blaming colonialism, you know, as such, as the main reason for corruption in Africa. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we have increasingly imported Western values. The systems that we have, the Western values, and I don't think Ethiopia is an island of that. And these Western values come with these things. I want to have a house like this, big house, 5 cars, and that breed into corruption. So I was saying, maybe the answer for us is to go back to our original African values in trying to fight this. My sister from South Sudan, I'm really very sorry about her experience. I didn't know that she was arrested, and I think I'm not denying there's no corruption in South Sudan. I said in the beginning that there is prevalent corruption in South Sudan. Okay, and I told you some of the findings of the report, the corruption percent report that we had, that 90% of the people that we surveyed said that corruption was widespread to the highest level in the country. And I also mentioned the forfeitures. I talked about the Senator report that came out 2 years ago. So I'm not denying anything. I'm not saying that there is no corruption in South Sudan. There is corruption in South Sudan, and we have to attend to it, and we have to address it. So our culture, there are some aspects of culture that are good. In South Sudan, there are some ethnic groups where, you all know about age sets. I don't want to turn this into an anthropological class, but you know what about age sets. There are some ethnic groups in South Sudan where all women and men of the same age are members of the age set, okay? And they are all consulted when they want to go to war. When they want to go to war, they will all sit, and women will sit with the male colleagues, and they would argue that we're going to go to war, or we're not going to go to war, or whatever they want to do. So I think that is a very interesting setup, we don't have it in our current situation because it is in this present situation where women are marginalized, are disempowered. Okay, so I was talking about those kind of examples that are good examples that we can build on them. But obviously there are some bad aspects of cultures that we may want to get rid of. So why don't we look into those kind of things in trying to attempt to look at how we could best empower women. Now, empowering women, of course, we talked about agency, we talk about activism, we talk about advocacy. And the most important thing is sacrifice. Women must be ready to sacrifice, and sacrifice a lot. The example of the woman that I told you in the beginning, she even died because she was fighting for women's rights. So we need to have people like that to be able to get to where we want to go to. So it's not an easy thing. It's not something that we can talk to in a very cold room and we go home. No, it's not like that. You have to be. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I was just thinking yesterday how women fought for their rights. And actually how as human beings, some of us, our ancestors had to fight for some rights. Meaning that rights, most of the times or at times, are not just given. You fight for them. And then from there we have institutions that would guarantee those rights, that would enshrine these rights in legal instruments, and somehow we get to enjoy them when you know of them, when you know of the rights you are entitled to. When we look at corruption and how corruption distorts allocation of resources and how corruption also misguides or modifies the rules of accountability and inclusion, it goes back to our human rights and how we are given them or how we claim them and how we enjoy them. So when we don't have institutions that are in place to actually guarantee those human rights, and now in our case, women's rights, then it becomes problematic. We see that relationship between corruption and women's rights violations. They become so rife in places or in countries where certain human rights institutions are not strengthened, they're not promoted, they are not, their accountability mechanisms are also not up to par. So you can see a correlation between corruption and human rights or corruption and women's rights.
Thank you.
I'll answer a few questions. Tigis from Ethiopia. Women's equal participation should not be linked with what they can do for a country, but should be based on being a fundamental right. And this is where I think we should be careful not to instrumentalize women. This old adage of add women and stir, smart economics. If you have X number of more women in an economy, it means the economy is better. You're not doing it for the economy. The end point is not the economy. The end point is for equality. Equity is but a tool and a means to get towards a point of equality. And so with that, I do agree. Tapo from Nigeria, on patriarchy having deep roots. This is for you. And again, I go back to the politics of language and what we call corruption. And as my fellow panelists said, I can't imagine, I don't know how to say corruption in Kikuyu, in my mother's language, for example. But because of that, corruption is then relegated to just being monetary. And we forget that it can be corruption in other ways. So sexual harassment and the AU report that just came out this month, and women's bodies being transactionalized, and what does that mean, and how do we quantify it, and how do we express it in that form? You also asked about what a human rights approach to corruption is, and we see it from a feminist perspective. And a lot of the time I get this question, what's the difference between a feminist analysis and gender mainstreaming? And a feminist analysis brings in questions of power, the politics of things. It's not just the numbers, but it's a deeper analysis, and this is where we come from as Femnet. And so the economic analysis that we use is progressive. It's progressive realization, it's non-retrogression and non-discrimination. And so you can look at it in two ways. Mainstream economics measures progress using very narrow conservative measurements like GDP, which essentially just measures 1% of most of our economies. Low price inflation is another way of measuring. Heterodoxical feminist economics, things like that we prefer to use, push for progressive realization and non-retrogression and provide alternative measurements. And these are linked to progress towards the fulfillment of a range of rights. And so the happiness index in Bhutan, for example, then measures how happy, how dignified a person is rather than just economic measurements. And so this is something that we try and make sure is mainstreamed across the work that we do. There's a question on, I think it was a comment from Mozambique, and there was a lot that was said, but I also like to just say that the reconfiguration of the status quo, breaking down of inequality towards a more egalitarian, towards a more equal society, means that somebody is going to give up some comforts. And that, I think, is what makes a lot of people who sit in positions of power extremely uncomfortable. They'll have to drive one car and not have the luxury of having 5 Mercedes-Benzes outside. They actually have one house rather than having a plethora of houses across the French Riviera, for example. And so that threat of taking something away, I think, is what's scary. But at the same time, it means that we can all live in some level of dignity and some level of quality of life that we're all aspiring to be, and not at the cost of anyone else.
Thank you. Thelma?
No question was directly directed to me, but I just want to speak briefly on the mechanisms. I think for us, what we've learned from the Nigerian experience is to focus more on preventive mechanisms, because even when the money leaves, it's very easy. You put a lot of resources, try to get them back, and most times you don't even get them back, and when you get them back, you don't get all of them back. And I think what emulating is the step the Nigerian government took to implement open contracting. And I know it's something that is what's being replicated, is a best practice that I think other African countries can also emulate. And I know some other African countries recently joined the Open Government Partnership, for example. So I think the OGP already provides a unique platform that can enable other AU members or other African countries to push for open contracting as one of the ambitious commitments within the National Action Plan of the OGP. So another mechanism also is the Whistleblowers Act that was passed in Nigeria, because it's also when you're also preventing, making sure that, because for us in Nigeria, for the open contracting, we've actually seen a quite lot of impact, because it allows for ordinary citizens to have access to public expenditure-related information, to track how public resources are being developed. And in that way also, government knows who has most of the resources that are being plugged into the development sector, and knows where the red flags are more. And also, it also gives a wider participation. It allows for a wider participation. Different stakeholders, the business, the private sector, for example, also are part of the stakeholders that monitors and tracks how public resources are being utilized. Then the citizens themselves are also part of them, and then the regulators. So it provides a multi-stakeholder approach that allows different people understand their user need of data and also of open contracting. I think is what emulating, because we've seen quite a number of impacts having open contracting. But again, the whistleblower, like I said, has also been very, very helpful. But again, strengthening it in a way that when people blow these whistles, they don't get discouraged, because they don't get to be protected the way they should. So making sure that we strengthen them, building processes, strong, efficient systems that lives beyond the people who are in power at that particular time, in a way that is sustained, and in a way that the government can be the one, funding this, because some of them, for example, are donor dependent, donor funded. So how do we also grow beyond? How do we sustain some of all these initiatives? I think it's also very important.
Thank you. There was a round of hands that was left over from the last discussion. I'll start with my sister Amma. My brother, I see you, number 2. I see you, my sister at the back with the yellow and red. Joab, I see you, and I see you, my sister, with the black and white spots. So let's take it in that order, and then finishing with my sister in red sequins. You can wrap up this round for us. Huh? Uchenna.
Thank you, my sister from another country. Mine is more of a comment, but I'll end with a question. To me, I believe that the fight against corruption is not for the faint-hearted. Why do I say that? I believe that human beings are inherently corrupt. And so it takes determination, to fight corruption, deliberate and conscious efforts to fight corruption. Now, who takes the lead? We are saying that we need political leadership. Politics itself is corrupt. So where do we go from here? Do we use civil society? Do we use NGOs? Or what? We need definitive leadership in the fight against corruption, which has been going on for years, for ages, I should say. But we've not reached anywhere. So I guess my question is, after all is said and done, where do we stand? What do we do? Where do we go from here? Women's rights is human rights. And human rights, we are all born free. But society changes things. Thank you.
My brother.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much from our moderator. May I please start from, I am noticing that in this house, there's corruption from our moderators. I don't know what they are getting. I've been raising my hand since our last session, and I'm seeing that it seems like there's something that is going on that we don't know. This side seems to be doing some things that we don't know. So having said that, may I please first introduce myself? I am Menzi Tulani Hlabatsi, coming from the Kingdom of Eswatini. I am a police officer currently stationed at the police headquarters under the Department of Criminal Investigations as a training officer. Mine will start from the session in the morning. I'll try not to be long. We're talking about the frameworks that are in place and the protocols that we have. From my understanding is that I feel that before you'd want to have any documents or systems to be put in place, the first thing that I believe that should be done, I would maybe take from the same words of Her Excellency, Madam Ambassador Ama at the first bench, that I believe in capacity building. For something to be best implemented, if you want to implement something, first start from building the capacity of the people who will be affected by the change or whatever thing that you want to maybe implement or put in place. Secondly, now then I'll jump into the part on patriarchy. We've said a lot about patriarchy since morning, and I believe that looking at patriarchy it stems from socialization. We've been asking this question since morning, where do we start? Her Excellency just mentioned even now, where do we start? I believe that we could start from socialization. I've seen so many programs looking into building capacity of the girl child. I believe that we could start also engage the boy child, because as a man, we benefit a lot. There's so much that we benefit from patriarchy, but then now we expect to, we'll find women standing up and fighting for their rights, but at the same time, men are not really that involved in the fight against maybe, what's this? No, this thought just skipped. Okay, against women's rights. So I believe that we could, as men, work together, because at work, where I work in Swaziland, I was also assigned to take part in the gender network, which is within the police service itself. There's so many slurs that I was getting for being involved in gender issues. As one of the speakers mentioned earlier on, that issues of gender are not just issues. They need people who are strong to stand up and say or denounce some of these things that are going on that affect women. As a man, I would also like to implore our brothers in this house that it has to start with us. And also, we also have to start with us and work hand in hand with women to with empowerment and everything that we're doing. But most of all, what I'm saying is, I believe that we should build capacity before we maybe put the systems in place, or put the systems in place and have certain clauses that will have like maybe a clause that will speak much on building capacity. I thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
The next person was Joab, and then my sister in yellow with the red flowers.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My question goes to my brother from South Sudan. You mentioned, in your response to the question from my sister from Ethiopia, you mentioned that we're being influenced by the outside world. I mean, there's something that I'd like you to respond to. We know corruption happens across the globe, but what I realize is that when it happens in the rest of the world, the money that is acquired illicitly is reinvested in the economy. But we as Africans, we have a high affinity of investing outside our countries. Why, in the course of your work, have you ever tried to ask yourself why this happens to Africa? Because I believe that when we invest the resources that we acquire through corruption, the government is likely again to generate revenue, maybe through taxing that property that you build using the same money, and finance development in our own continent. Just your thoughts on that. Why do we have a high affinity towards investing outside the continent?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Felista Abdallah. I come from Kenya. I work with an organization called the Kenyan Sex Workers Alliance. So I'm glad today because we are talking about women's rights violation and corruption. Then when I was listening to the morning session, somebody said that the only way to end corruption is by making sure that people who corrupt, people who bribe, who give bribe and receive bribe, all of them should be in for it. Then I looked at a sex worker's life in Kenya, and I look at the sex workers the way they have to bribe the police for them to be free from violence. In Kenya from 2016, every month sex workers are dying. 20 sex workers are dying from violence. Female sex workers, not male. Women's organizations have never stood up to protect their fellow women. Why? Simply because they earn from their bodies, which is the personal decisions that the sex workers have made. When I looked at it and the discussions were going on in the morning, and I was happy because this time we were talking about it because it is the last time to talk about violations. Violations have been happening in Africa. But when I look at the Africans women's movement, we have categorized ourselves. We have the good women and the bad women. Yet we say we think when women are taking the seats, they can change the world. If we are not changing the world right now, then when do we want to change it? Because other women are dying because of who they are, because of what they do. Yet we are sitting here saying we want to end corruption. My life and the life of the sex workers is all about corruption. Because if I do not corrupt a police officer, then I do not survive in my own world. And that is the world I live in. So let's have realistic and real discussions in the room. Yes.
Thank you, Felista. My sister here, next. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I've been one of those, my name is Rita Achiro from Uganda. I've been one of those who has been raising the hand since morning. And I gave up at one point. But you know, once you're an activist, you never give up. And I have a couple of issues, but I'm going to be very brief. One, I think we, since morning, have been talking about how corruption affects men and women disappropriately. However, when we talk about gender, we've been focusing on women. And I really want us to be clear that gender is not about women. And I think it is also going to be important for us to show the difference of how corruption affects men and women differently for us to be able to build this campaign. Otherwise, men, as usual, might think this is a women's thing. But also ensure that we complete the cycle, that while corruption affects men and women, boys and girls differently, it has repercussion on men and boys as well. If your mother dies because she cannot access reproductive health, that means so many orphans will be left, and the father, we need to connect those dots, because this is something where we have to build a movement. And to build a movement around corruption, it cannot only be a women's burden. The other thing which I think is also generic is the fact that we've been talking really broadly, very generic. I've had very little data, and the information we're providing, personally, I find it, it's just we're vague, and we're glossing over these issues. So if I was the policy maker, what am I taking home to show that this is a grave issue, that is affecting women and men in different ways, in health, in education, in politics, in everything else? Where is the statistics? Who is in charge? Is the African governance architect going to help us? Is it the responsibility of different governments and states? Is it the responsibility of civil society? Whose responsibility is it for us to be able to collect the data and statistics? So I would really want us, maybe by tomorrow, if we could have quick facts to show, yes, I heard in the morning how much money we are losing, which is okay, but break it down to show how grave this is affecting the lives of our people. I would like to stop there so that others can contribute. Thanks.
Thank you. Uchenna?
Okay. I have two questions. My name is Uchenna Idoko from Nigeria. I have two questions, one for my sister Ifoma, and the other one for Crystal of Femnet. My first question is that you've talked about open contracting in Nigeria. But in that space of contracting, especially in the public contracting, you don't have women entrepreneurs playing key roles. You don't have a lot of women entrepreneurs involved in public procurement. And like you rightly said, that is where a lot of corruption happens. And I always believe that if you open spaces, corruption will reduce. If you bring every player in, corruption will. I know you and women and a whole lot of other players are trying to get women to play, to be players in public procurement in Nigeria, which is very difficult for women for a lot of reasons. So I don't know if your organization is already working around it. And for me, open contracting, it might be easier for women to serve as monitors, but they need to also begin to serve as players, people building those structures, and not just people monitoring to ensure that things are done well. And then my other question is a follow-up to what Crystal really talked about, quantitative and qualitative data. Our confusion, especially as a researcher, is also around when you're writing reports, like responding to some of these regional instruments, like the AU report, the CEDAW report. Where will you put the qualitative data in them? For example, we just had a voice in the room from South Sudan saying, this happened to me. But at that level of reporting, where policy will change, you don't have such indicators that will carry individual voices. All you are reporting against is indicator A, which is macro. And then but the voices, the qualitative report that will change things for women, it's at those individual voices. Even if it's coming from each country or states in that we are reporting on. So I don't know we need to begin to think about changing our mechanism of reports so that I can carry this qualitative, or else if we keep giving numbers, like we're already asking in the room, give numbers and data, things might never change from even the next generation for women, because we don't have the numbers, but our voices and our stories are all over the place, and they're fictional, And we need them in the document of our governance, at the region, at the national, and even international. If you go to UNCSW, for example, there's a lot of meetings holding at this different time, different voices, but at the end of the day, when you see the report, they don't show those individual voices. So it's a major concern for me.
Thank you, Uche. We started late. Had we started at the time we would be ending now. So I'm going to give our panelists a chance to respond, starting from Crystal, my sister here, Ife Oma, and we finish with you. And then I will try and do a wrap-up of what some of the emerging recommendations are, and then we can have a final round, just in case there's anything that I have left out or you think has been a blind spot and we need to take on board as recommendations for this session. Crystal.
Okay, so I'll first start with the first question from Ambassador on the front row, in terms asking where do we begin? Sitting from where I sit at Femnet and being a Pan-African feminist, I think there's space for all of us. I think political will needs to meet civic action. I feel that space needs to be legislated for that to happen. I feel there's a role for all of us to play and this isn't a fight that can be won by just one party. So the space for voice, the space for whistleblowers, the space for whistleblowers to be protected needs to be ensured. Political will from governments to resource the fight needs to be accorded, and that's the only way that implementation happens. It's the only way that you can see the seriousness of a government's saying they're fighting corruption. But I see small changes happen, and fighting for women's rights is hard and sometimes very thankless, but I celebrate small wins. My small wins today are celebrating the AGA Secretariat. For the first time, they call this meeting Corruption and Women's Rights in Africa rather than Gender and Corruption. And I think we need to celebrate them. We need to celebrate them for diversifying the voices in this room. Felista spoke from the Sex Workers Alliance of Kenya. The African Union is for the people of Africa, by the people of Africa. Felista is part of that. And it's very important and very, very special that we have a diversity of voices in this room. So I'll move to the question from Eswatini, the Kingdom of Eswatini. So if we understand corruption as a symptomatic issue of a skewed power system, it's the only way we can begin to go forward. And you begin to build on that through your conversation around patriarchy. I was in Ghana last week and someone spoke to me about this. Imagine this. You're walking through a busy street and everybody keeps grabbing at your body parts. You speak up, but you're shut down. You have no right to open your mouth, they say. They grab you some more, your body is in pain, so you are in pain. It is such an awkward mind space, feeling the pain of a body that hurts because you carry that body. You own it. It belongs to you, and yet all these people who do not share in the pain of this body claim ownership of it, and they would kill you to make that point. Welcome to the patriarchy. And so this also touches on Uchena's point of qualitative data, and at Femnet, this is what we fight for. We fight for data to be qualitative, not just quantitative, for voices who experience the lives as they do to be there to speak for themselves, but it's expensive. And this is a fight that we also fight with our donor partners. When I need to take a woman from rural Malawi to the CSW who doesn't speak a word of English, I need to make sure that she's traveling with someone who is able to translate for her on that long way through Amsterdam into New York, navigate the immigration in America, and sit with her on all those panels to translate not just from English and French, but from Chichewa to English and French. It takes money, it takes resources. And these are things that we need to push for in terms of how do we change the narrative? How do we change the frameworks in the way that we're collecting data and telling our stories? There's a question on data, and I think this was from Rita, and she was looking for something a little bit more granular, a little bit more nuanced, and this is precisely the problem as well, that we have almost no data in terms of data that's disaggregated, even in terms of sex, male and female, it's almost not there. But further to that, data that's disaggregated by economic quintile, geographic location, ethnic grouping, religion. So by then you can begin to identify exactly where the problem is and begin to build strategies to it. Our governments are not collecting this data, and so we need to be pushing for that to happen. We also need to be telling our own stories and generating our own knowledge and data so that we can back up whatever advocacy claims we're pushing for from an evidence-based perspective. But the problem and the crux of it is that we can't, it's very hard for us to put numbers and figures when those numbers and figures are not being collected, and we don't have the frameworks to it. I push for data to be central to the work that we do, but recently I've been thinking about that as a strategy and thinking about how we always have to work along frameworks of collecting data that have been placed upon us by many a time the West. And it almost feels like we have to legitimize our problems in figures and facts. And in the meantime, the problem keeps going on. And so how do we balance working on solving these issues, collecting the data to back it up, but also making sure that we're working to solve this issue and not having the perfect framework to collect the data in?
Thank you very much, Crystal. I'll just speak on what Her Excellency said, or what she asked. Where to from here? You know, it's a very difficult question to really answer when you deal with an issue that's like at the center of a web. Like how do you move from a policy discussion on that, you know, that includes dealing with education and capacity building and inclusion of everyone. I think that's where maybe, you know, we're even talking about women's rights violations today, because the issues that we deal with that are exacerbated by corruption are not easy. We can concur that corruption does distort allocation of resources that would go to education. I mean, in 2018, to still have people who are illiterate in Africa with the resources that we have, one begs to question, but why? What is it about us, you know, puts us in the position that we're in? What is it about our leadership? What is it about our governance that puts us where we are? And it goes back to us as a people. Where have we gone wrong? What are we doing so wrong that our children still do not go to school? I mean, I think we're a group of elites in this room, in a way. But what about that woman and that girl and that boy in the rural area who do not have access to information, who do not have access to justice because the institutions that we're supposed to fight for, we do not fight for them? Because we also do not know how we can actually advocate. It's little steps that we can take. It's little steps that we can take and push for advocacy, for accountability mechanisms to be put in place, to push for integrity systems to be put in place. So sometimes we can say, yes, we're just talking here and nothing is going forward, we're not doing anything, but this trajectory of building a democracy, expensive as well, is where we are, is where we find ourselves. But now the work really begins with us who are in here, going back. How do we push in our little corners? How do we push that what we're discussing today becomes a policy somewhere? And that policy is known by someone in a rural area, and that someone will understand it to the point of supporting it when you bring a petition to go to a councillor, to go to a member of parliament, to go to your ombudsman, to go to institutions that are there to safeguard democracy, institutions that are there to safeguard integrity and transparency and protect whistleblowers. I sometimes say I am tired of hearing people say that democracy and certain principles are Westerners' principles and ideologies. But so what are our principles then? What is so Western about integrity, for example? Whether you call it in Setswana, Boama, Ruri, or Buikarabelo, what is so Western about it and what is so bad about it? What is so bad about transparency as a principle? What is so bad about accountability as a principle? I think if we could just answer those questions before we come up with excuses for doing nothing, it might actually help us go somewhere. It might actually help us really advocate for better lives of those people we say we are fighting for. It might help us fight for the women who are not sitting here and who are not sitting there, but are actually struggling out there, living life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there were two questions, I think, raised that concerned me. Our colleague from the police officer, I think he talked about socialization and that as an issue. I think education, as I said in the beginning, is key to this, that we need to provide education for our young ones. But I think there's also another element which we haven't touched this afternoon, that is poverty. Poverty is a big issue in Africa. And you find that manifested itself in even the education system that we have. So for example, education is not free anymore. There are not many countries in Africa where education is free. I think Ghana went for free secondary school, and Ghana was one of the few African countries that managed to attain the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, plus I think Rwanda. And so that is something I think we need to push for, free education. Because at the moment, we have a situation where 1 in 5 children, you've got 1 girl among 5 boys that go to school in most of our sub-Saharan African countries. And that is because of poverty. Because if I have got 5 children and I have got a daughter that I would think would be married off to another family, and I wouldn't want to invest in her education. So we should push for girl education and free education. So that is one important aspect, poverty. When we speak to colleagues on the continent about why some of these countries are doing well in fighting corruption, for example, Botswana, Rwanda, one of the answers that we get is that in Botswana, a primary school teacher can afford to buy a vehicle, a car. If you want to measure society, you look at the teachers, what is their pay, or how are they rated in the society. So if you have a society where a primary school teacher can afford to buy a car, in South Sudan, primary school teachers are leaving teaching and are going to the army because the army are paid better than primary school teachers. So this is one issue I think we need to think about, the question of poverty. Job talked about why we, this illicit financial flow, why do we send our money to Europe and America and places like that? And it brings back my point of colonialism. I think we need to decolonize. We need our mindset has to change. That you can fly here from Gaborone to London. Okay? When I came here yesterday, I had to change 3 planes. And I'm sure South Sudan is nearer to Botswana than London and Botswana. Okay? You can, so this mentality, our leaders have got this mentality, this colonial mentality. When they take this money, they believe that they're not going to stay here. They're going to go to America, to Europe, and live there. And that's why they take the money to those places. I'm not talking about the Abachas and the Mobutus of this world. So this is the mentality that I think that we have, and we need to change that mentality so that even this money which is taken away is corrupted, is used in our places, in our countries.
Thank you, Kuyok.
Thank you very much. So when we say where do we begin, I think it takes me back to where we started in Nigeria in terms of procurement reforms. So I think first thing first is identification, acknowledging that you have a problem. And then how do you solve that problem? Because we asked that question, where do we begin? And then we realized that it takes a multi-stakeholder approach, and political will is very, very critical and very important. So, but even when you have the political will, for example, commitment doesn't really translate to action. So that's why civil societies, the media, for example, there's need for everybody to, leverage on each other, build synergy, leverage on the resources, available resources and strengths to push things forward. The political will, when the government committed, we didn't really see that action that translates to implementation, because over time implementation has always been a problem. But then you have the media, because we started training investigative journalists who go to the field and started collating the data from these women. So we even did a documentary that assesses the impact of projects that governments are delivering within the local communities. And we found out that 80% of the projects we visited, none of them were constructed, but while in the data you have, it speaks to, having all these projects being delivered. But in the real sense, when you get to the grassroots level, you find out that none of them were actually executed. So even when you have the commitment, then the journalists started writing data-driven stories that speaks to the real impact and what those local communities are facing. Those stories get out there, and people see the stories and they pick it up. We have a case study, one community that we call that community. Now we know the things that are happening there because we took it up. Investigative journalists joined us in the fight, and people started interrogating, why don't we have this project? Because in that community, there's supposed to be a 40 million health center there, but nothing was there. So the people took it up, the community themselves, they took it up and they started questioning the contractor. And just a few months ago, the contractor returned to the field. So other communities, it became a best practice that neighboring states took up. Now it's not even civil societies. All we need to do is when we are going to the field, we take investigative journalists who go there and pick those stories and write them. So you're seeing what the impact these stories they write make, and also the people themselves take these things up, because I believe it's a collective effort. And then when you talk about open contracting, for example, that's also why we wanted, because why do we have, a procurement system, but we can't really see efficiency or the private sector bringing their own expertise to execute contracts for the government? Probably because they don't even trust them. So there's this issue of distrust. How are you sure that if you pay all the money and bid for public contract that you will have them? And then how many women, because we also know that from findings that there are women who also have companies who are also very efficient and can do all those things, but they don't have that, they don't have the leverage to even compete with the men. But with open contracting, it's not based on who you know, but what you can offer. Because it's an open system, it's a watchdog system, for example. So you can, even if you like, pay anybody, but people will question. And eventually, we've had case studies where contracts were awarded, and we took it up, and people started questioning.